and by striking at the shackles of interest, barakah was returned. Trade thus flourished under the Islamic State, which also operated on a tax-free basis besides the nominal amount of zakat. And as the state continued to expand, in the year 77 Hijri, Amir al-Mu'mineen Abdul Malik ibn Marwan took it upon himself to ensure all shirki symbols and figurative representations from the coins presently in circulation were removed. He thus ordered for the minting of the first dinar coin to be struck by the Islamic State free of figurative representations. The Khalifa also took the necessary measures to protect the purity and weight of the coins in circulation, in obedience to Allah's instructions.
وَأَوْفُوا الْكَيْلَ إِذَا كِلْتُمْ وَزِنُوا بِالْقِسْطَاسِ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ ذلك خير وأحسن تأويلا.
Likewise, in obedience to Allah's commands, the Muslims weighed the coins in larger transactions to protect the seller from methods of fraud, such as shaving parts of a gold dinar coin. The light of Allah's commands continued to illuminate the horizons. From its capital in Baghdad, it now spanned across the regions, settling in Europe in a land of sprawling fields that the Muslims called Al-Andalus, where the Islamic State continued to maintain the true measure of wealth through the circulation of gold dinars and silver dirhams. Thus, pricing remained streamlined and trade more efficient and uninhibited by borders and taxes. From the straight path revealed in Mecca to the fountains of knowledge in Baghdad to the sprawling beauty of Al-Andalus, the Islamic State was truly a beacon of light for the entire world. But whilst Al-Andalus and the rest of the Ummah lived under this golden light, the rest of Europe was drenched in kufr and blinded by an age of darkness, a land of feuding kingdoms plagued with greed and indecency, where the society's moral fabric only continued to decay. The various kingdoms each used coins specific to them. This made the business of exchanging one coin denomination for another and charging a commission for the service very profitable. Furthermore, in order to attract gold and silver coinage, the bankers began to pay interest on coins stored in their vaults. The bankers, however, noticed that not all depositors redeemed their gold and silver coinage at the same time. This phenomenon would signal the next phase of corruption, which came to be known as fractional reserve banking. To illustrate, an individual deposits 20 gold coins with the bank on the condition that he receives 1 gold coin per month as an interest payment on the deposit. If another 4 individuals do the same, the bank then has 100 coins stored in its reserves. At the end of the month, however, only 1 individual returns to redeem his deposit of 20 coins, and to also receive his interest payment of 1 gold coin. But instead of using its own gold to make the interest payment, the bank uses the gold coins of its customers deposited in its reserve. So the bank is left with 79 coins stored in its reserve, and with the expectation that not all of their customers would return to redeem their coins all at the same time, the bank could then loan out a fraction of their coin deposits to new customers. They could, for example, loan 2 customers 20 gold coins each on condition that they also pay the bank back the amount of the loan plus an extra 2 gold coins as an interest payment. So now, not only were the banks accruing wealth from wealth through interest, they were now increasing their wealth with wealth that they didn't even own, because it was their customers' gold they were lending out and not their own. These practices in fact gave rise to the creation of what is in circulation today, banknotes. Initially, when the people placed their gold or silver coins in these banks to accrue interest, the depositor would receive a receipt or a promissory note, entitling the bearer to the amount of gold and silver coins written on the note. The note merely represented a promise to pay the bearer in coin the sum of the note on demand. The true wealth lay in the gold and silver coins and not in the note itself. The business of banking became so profitable that multinational branches were formed, vying to do business with merchants, from the merchants of Venice to the merchants of London. Here in London, the first reserve bank was established and named the Bank of England. but it was backed by the force of the English government, which institutionalized and enforced the usage of paper banknotes. Using the Reserve Bank of England as their model, the bankers further developed and proliferated this tyrannical system throughout Europe. And after much initial opposition, in 1332 Hijri, 1913 Common Era, the model was replicated in America with the establishment of the Federal Reserve. And like its counterpart, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve was also a private corporation and exclusive banker to the government that was granted the power to print Federal Reserve notes redeemable for gold coins upon demand. So the gold standard, that is, tying the note to real gold, is what gave these fraudulent notes some legitimacy. Less than a year after the Federal Reserve was established, the various nations would witness the First World War. Britain invaded Iraq with the help of her old proxies, the Rafida. The spoils of war came in the form of Muslim lands and the oil that lay beneath them. Finding inspiration in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Crusaders carved the Muslim lands into nation-states, and the Jews were allocated their own state, a state founded with the massacre of countless Muslims and protected by the newly installed Arab puppet Tawaghit. America remained out of the fight until the end of the war. It chose instead to build its economy by manufacturing munitions and shipping them out along with other exports across the Atlantic to Europe. American workers were paid with a piece of paper, Federal Reserve notes, and payments from Europe into America were made with the true measure of wealth, gold. And to continue funding their wars, the Tawaghit of Europe abandoned the gold standard. That is, they broke their promise to back these notes with gold. As the notes no longer had any gold backing, the governments just kept printing more and more. In Germany, the sheer volume of banknotes increased by a staggering amount. When countries simply print notes irrespective of the demand for goods and services, prices simply rise. In Germany, bread that cost 100 marks at the beginning of the war rose to 2 billion marks by the end of the war. So the people of Germany not only lost their gold to the Tawaghit, they also lost their savings, because the mark just became another meaningless piece of paper. Soon after World War I, America also abandoned the gold standard on a domestic level, confiscating the American people's real wealth through an executive decree and ordering the American people to hand in all their gold. The Federal Reserve then printed new dollar bills and removed the words redeemable in gold. Now, on a domestic level, a Federal Reserve note was only redeemable for another Federal Reserve note. With gold out of the equation, banknotes now became the preeminent measure of all goods and services. The bankers had successfully replaced gold, which Allah created as the ultimate measure. Gold, real wealth that was toiled for and extracted from the earth's crust and sifted before being melted and converted into coinage, replaced by a piece of paper imposed on the people and printed at the discretion of the Tawaghit throughout the world. Shortly after this great theft, the world was blasted by the shock of World War II. The warring nations yet again exhausted their gold supplies through war. But in the early stages of the war, America resorted to the same tactics they had previously employed in World War I, selling armaments, food, and other commodities to Europe in return for gold. With the great influx of gold from the two world wars, coupled with the gold confiscation, America now held a high proportion of the world's gold. It used this position of strength to organize a meeting in Bretton Woods with over 40 other nations. Here it developed a new banking and foreign exchange system post-World War II, called the Bretton Woods system. Under this new system, the Federal Reserve note would remain on an international level, redeemable for gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce, and the rest of the nations would link their notes to the Federal Reserve note. The Federal Reserve was now the banker to all the nations of the world. Countries therefore now had to accumulate dollars in their reserves in order to engage in international trade. And how did they acquire these dollars? They had to give America either their exports or their gold. In return, all the Federal Reserve had to do was print pieces of paper worth next to nothing. filled with arrogance and brimming with worthless dollar notes. America now attempted to implement this capitalist system worldwide, beginning with the communist mushrik nation of Vietnam. But America's war with Vietnam exposed their fraud to the world. To continue funding the Vietnam War, the Federal Reserve printed and lent out more notes to the American government than it could ever redeem for gold. Nations worldwide began taking note of this fraud, and in the years leading to the end of the Vietnam War, they began exercising their redemption rights to gold, which resulted with the commencement of the flow of gold out of America. To protect their remaining gold reserves, the Federal Reserve counteracted with another conceded presidential decree, this time delivered by President Nixon, who annulled the Bretton Woods system by canceling all redemption rights to gold.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This meant that the Federal Reserve note for the first time was no longer backed by gold on an international level. It was now just another worthless piece of paper. And because the dollar was no longer redeemable for gold, the Jewish former chairman of the Federal Reserve arrogantly proclaimed,
"The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default."
In fact, following the Nixon decree, the amount of base dollars in circulation generated by the Federal Reserve rose from a little over $200 billion to over $2.5 trillion. And through the process of fractional reserve banking, this time under the Federal Reserve System, banks are also allowed to create new digital dollars called bank credit against loan contracts such as mortgages. In fact, this is how most of the dollars in circulation are generated, as the graph reveals. Now, at the peak of the satanic system stands the application of the most insidious instrument, interest. To borrow dollars from the Federal Reserve, the American government first issues a bond, which is simply a loan contract to borrow a set amount of dollars and pay them back with interest. The Federal Reserve then purchases these bonds via private banks, and upon completion of this transaction, Federal Reserve notes are simply printed into existence. But when the Federal Reserve creates dollars against a bond, or when banks create dollars against a loan contract for that matter, only the amount of principal on the loan is actually created. But the loan has to be paid back with interest. So a question arises. If the banks are creating these dollars through loans, then where do the dollars to pay back the interest come from? The answer is they don't exist. For under this fraudulent system, the debt's total amount, the principal plus interest, will always be greater than the amount of the principal on the loan. Therefore, extra dollars have to continually be borrowed into existence in order to pay for the oppressive interest payments on the loan, as financial analyst Mike Maloney illustrates.
When your currency supply is all owed back plus interest, and the currency to pay the interest does not exist yet, it means that you always have to go deeper in debt. And so if the public doesn't always borrow more to cover the principal plus the interest that's owed on the currency supply, then the whole thing goes into a deflationary collapse.
This also means that inflation is an inherent and perpetual part of this evil system, as new dollars are always required to be pumped into it. Therefore, prices will always rise. The dollar has, in fact, lost almost all of its value since the Federal Reserve came into existence. To put this into perspective, a loaf of bread that cost 6 cents at the time of the Federal Reserve's inception today costs over $1.50. That's a price increase of over 2,200%. As Ron Paul points out, this is plain theft because it robs the people of their savings.
There's a dollar crisis out there, and people's money is being stolen. People who have saved, they're being robbed. I mean, if you have a devaluation of the dollar at 10%, people have been robbed of 10%.
Now, with so many dollars being generated, a couple of important questions